before we get right into it, let me just briefly introduce you guys about myself and what the channel is going to be about. I'm Messiah, otherwise known as Myra, and I'm currently studying in Italy. Studying in Italy allows me to grind the European competitive circuit, and in this channel I'm going to be taking you all on my competitive journey where I aim for that PT and world invite, while also showing you the behind the scenes of a professional team and how we work, the conclusions we come across through my deck guides, and also the actual travel and the gathering through my vlogs. So I guess it's fitting that my very first video is going to be me recapping on my Pro Tour testing journey for PT Lauren with my team Worldly Counsel. So this video is going to be split into 4 parts, where the first part is going to be more about the logistical side, what goes into a PT testing, the actual testing house, and the travels. The second is going to be just a brief recap on the limited preparation Eduardo helped the team and how I was able to grow as a player and gain confidence even on the Pro Tour level. The third is going to be the constructed aspect, where I recap some of the brews that we tried all the way to the actual deck that we registered as a team and why we registered them. And lastly, I'm also going to be briefly recapping on the actual tournament itself and some of the learning opportunities I was able to get out of from my Pro Tour. So how did I even get there? Because unlike the traditional way of qualifying, like the AMPs, the regional championship, and even the Spotlight series, I actually qualified in a different way. I actually got there by taking down the 2025 Axion Out Invitational, which is a standalone open tournament series in the UK. After countless of near misses in the RCs and Spotlight, this was the very last opportunity for me to qualify to PT in Richmond. Similarly to the NRG circuit in the US that hosts big opens throughout the year, Axion also hosts opens, and the top player of that year are all invited to compete in the end of year invitational, where the winner gets to go to the PT. I was super fortunate enough to take down the whole thing with this weapons affinity list that Jaime, also from Worldly Counsel, recommended and helped me test, and I wouldn't have won without him, so big shout outs and big thank you to him. Already a bit of spoilers, but who did I test with for the PT itself? Like usual, I was very fortunate to test with Team Worldly Counsel, where many of you may know as Mengu's team, but to more in-depth introduce you to my friends on the team, we have many fantastic players and also just human beings. For example, we have many European champions such as Alex, Pivo, and Matteo. We also have a South American RC champion and world top 8 competitors in Lorenzo Terlizzi and Derek, known Magic Online grinder and Mox champion in Moged, aka Clara Lampos, one of the most beloved GOAT in the game, as well as one of the best limited player in the world in Kalk, and also another one of the best limited players in the world, and also our team limited coach in Eduardo, all captain by Zen from New Zealand. And I guess there's me. Haven't top 8'd anything in the premier level, but technically a UK champion. So usually before the PT, big teams always host a testing house where from the Friday prior to the Pro Tour weekend, teams usually rent out a big Airbnb for all the members to stay together in, and where they practice Magic all day. For us, this was from the Friday all the way down to the Thursday, but prior to the actual testing house and prior to flying to the US, I actually met up with Lorenzo in Milan, where he invited me over to his place, where we did a pre-testing house. I spent a few days at his place testing, gathering cards from card shops around the city for the testing house, and also just chilled, which was ton of fun. So big thanks to Lorenzo. Funniest part about that little testing house with Lorenzo was when he was showing me the city, he super confidently took me to his favorite gelateria, which was actually the same gelateria we have in Rome, and that built up suspense of him describing how good the gelato was, how it's his favorite and how it's even tier 0, just to see that, oh, I'm also very familiar with it, was just hilarious. But yeah, getting to spend time with him and also travel with him was just a ton of fun, so can't wait to do it again. So just briefly, that was the actual travel. We traveled from Milan to Frankfurt, where we then transited all the way to the final destination in DC. But on the trip, I actually lost my luggage. Like, they forgot to board it on the flight, so it was a bit delayed, and I was very worried because during the whole trip we were expecting to get hit with a severe snowstorm where there'll be like tens of inches of snow, and it'll be hard to not only travel around, it'll be hard to, you know, get groceries, and also in this case it would be really hard to get my suitcase delivered to the house on time. But luckily I was able to go back to the airport and pick it up right before the snowstorm. That was us on the very first day, I guess the day 0 of the testing house, where we went out to go collect some card from the UPS center. We did some, you know, exploration around the city, and I also just was able to explore Shake Shack, where, you know, as someone that's never lived in the US or have never really visited US extensively, I was really excited for my first Shake Shack experience. But the caveat to that was I actually had my dinner, my Panda Express, Ubered to the testing house already. So after eating Shake Shack, I went back to the house to have some Panda Express orange chicken. So yeah, Myra always permanent eating, I guess. And then another really cool part about the testing house is, you know, getting to hang out with some of the idols that inspired you, and also just getting to reunite with your friends around the world. For me, the most highlighted one was Calc, where I was inspired to play competitive Magic when Calc in Haruya taught me how to play the game. And since then, I've been really fortunate to be on the same testing team as him, travel to spotlights with him, go out to dinner with him, get to know him as a person and as a friend. And here in the testing house, finally get to reunite after some while. And just him helping us test for both limited and constructed was just so huge. And I'm also really glad that that effort and generosity he put in for us for the Pro Tour, I'm so glad that it came back to him, where he was able to then top 8 the spotlight in Toronto the week after and get back on the PT. So congratulations, Calc Senpai. It was so fun getting to hang out with you in the house, even doing some jersey swaps, even doing some late night testing and getting some advice on limited from the GOAT himself. And yeah, just so happy for you. And also it was a really fun, happy experience for me as well. Another key part about the testing house is we also have to, you know, have people cook, clean dishes, and help each other live, you know, with other players and teammates for a whole week. And the way we do that is by taking turns on who do the chores, who do the cooking, and even sharing some traditional snacks so that your teammates also get to know more about your culture. So for me, I planned to cook the traditional Japanese stew from the cubes, and it was supposed to be easy because you only had to dice the vegetables, boil, sear the meat, and then put the cube in, season it, and voila. However, my cooking skills is just not that good. It's kind of similar to my limited skill, and as much as it looks like I was doing a lot, I was hard carried by Connor and Noe, where I was more, you know, seasoning and just checking the pot, where Connor and Noe helped dicing and searing a lot. So big shout outs to them. Thank you for helping me out, and I'm glad that the stew came out alright. And then there's the limited section. This is the second part of the video where I talk a bit about the limited testing process. Not in depth, because Eduardo has talked about these and always reflect and present these to the public on his channel, but just on the perspective as someone who's let's just say absolutely abysmal and limited, how I basically leveled up my limited game through the guidance of everyone on Worldly Council, especially Eduardo. So the first thing that happens in the testing house, so on the Saturday morning, is we have a preliminary draft meeting where Eduardo actually just catches up to date on the week 0 and the week 1 format to help simulate the draft pod accurately, or at least as accurate as possible. Before the house, we're pretty much not banned, but advised not to do any draft to, you know, avoid forming some opinions or even some biases that Eduardo then has to go back and destroy. So we're coming in very fresh. We're learning what the format is about and what to look out for. So after the meeting, we do our first in-house draft. And the thing about these in-house draft is they're actually much harder than the average Pro Tour draft that we do in day 1 or even day 2. Like, especially with like Worldly Council being one of the dominant limited teams of the Pro Tour of this current age, it just means that with 7 other Worldly Council members, your pod draft is gonna be much harder than anything you can ever imagine of. And so it's normal to go 0-3, it's normal to go 1-2. It's less about the actual results that you obtain, but more about the actual learning that you get out of it. So just to show you some, this was my very first draft deck of the format, and I immediately go 0-3. I was able to pick Gloom Ripper. That's one of the most powerful bomb of the format, so I kind of just wanted to force a Golgari Elf shell. However, yeah, we kind of knew that Elves was very deep and very powerful, with many powerful removal and uncommon cards, which, you know, geared many people to draft them. And this was actually exactly what happened in our pod. Just some key cards. Like I said, I went 0-3. This deck basically didn't have a solid plan. Like, the plan was basically play a Gloom Ripper and hope it wins, which is, I guess, just not good enough. There's no overarching synergies besides just having elves, but these elves aren't even that good. My thought process when I was building this draft deck was basically, I want to prolong a game to a position where my Gloom Ripper can take over, so I want as many removal as possible. So I have 6 removal, 2 sentences, 1 nameless inversion, 1 embrace, 1 blight rot, and 1 assert perfection. Nameless inversion and assert perfection was stellar, with embrace being solid, but sentences were not bad, but it wasn't like super strong as I hoped it would be. I also decided to play 2 Unburies and a Dawn-Glow. A Dawn-Glow is a reanimation effect, and Unbury is a regrowth effect, all trying to rebuy this Gloom Ripper in case the first one doesn't win the game. To accompany this, I played Scout that hopefully milled over the Gloom Ripper. I even played like these Moon Gloves that I was thinking will help me draw into the Gloom Ripper, and then yeah, the Blackhorn and the Guide as solid top end. But basically, these Moon Gloves turned out to be really poor in this format, just because the stats of it being a 2-power attacker that needed to attack to gain card advantage was just really bad in board stalls. And then the Stoke Groove is basically just a vanilla creature that's not accomplishing that much, especially with this specific build where I don't have enough like scouts and mill effects to try and have this milled and get a 2/2 token for free. So overall, this deck's plan was draw into Gloom Ripper, remove, prolong the game, which wasn't enough. So Swift 0-3. Lots of learning to be made though. And during the draft, we actually do like take photos of our pack 1 and the picks that we made to not only like be able to present the pick orders and why and what you pick to during the draft review, so you can like rebuild the whole picture of the story of the draft through all 8 persons perspective. But it also helps, you know, to identify like what cards I picked and what I didn't end up playing, which I should have. For example, in this case, I probably should have just played like the Watcher over like these Moon Gloves. I was too like tunnel vision on the Elf synergy, hence I prioritized the Moon Gloves, which just shouldn't be the case. And even this Pummeler has a 5 mana, so 7 mana, but reduced by 2 the Golgari colors, so 5 mana 6/5 trample is just decent enough to be played probably over this guide or even just some of these changelings. But yeah, so that was my first draft, Swift 03. Expected it, but still it was making me worried that maybe, you know, my draft was so abysmal that it wouldn't be able to be fixed, even by the Master Eduardo himself. So immediately after that, my second draft, I actually was able to go 2-1. When I was drafting, I was very worried I would be building a similar Golgari no plans removal deck, which is kind of the case, but we were able to identify that this build was significantly better than the previous build, not just because I have like strong rares, but also my game plan was more cohesive with these midnight tillings, allowing me to draw into the important cards. So I guess I have 2 bombs, the Bearer, the Bitter Blossom, as well as Sapling Nursery. These 2 are a bit awkward because they're stretching the mana base quite a lot. Like Nursery kind of incentivizes me to play more forests, whereas Bitter Blossom wants me to play double swamp on the early turns. But I just figured like the Nursery was strong enough on its own, even when it's cast on turn 5 or 6. So yeah, I was able to also play a Mist Meadow Counsel, which is a cantripping creature that gets a cost reduction with a Kithkin in play. However, my deck does not have any Kithkins outside of these changelings, but we quickly identified that this card was just solid overall in any green decks, and just better with Kithkin, but not just, you know, solid in other decks as well. I played 3 Embrace and Perfection to be able to remove and prolong the game. I had Pitless Fist, which is just a very solid removal / buffer to punch through and try and trade with my opponent during the board stall. And I had these Midnight Tillings to try and reach and have access to Sapling Nursery as fast as possible. Some potential cards I discussed during the review I probably should have played was probably this Embrace, which is just a very powerful card in board stalls to punch through damage and trade up in cards with. So perhaps this could have just been instead of this Chaos Spewer that is just pretty awful in this format, as I was told. So yeah, during the second draft, I was starting to worry. I was like, oh, am I gonna, you know, draft another black-green pile? But, you know, not many elves to build like a hallmark elf deck, but luckily I had just enough of the right pieces to make it work. So key learning here is, if I was to make these decks with a bomb but not strong cohesive synergies, Midnight Tillings then become very, very premium to get access towards the bombs. Alright, so my confidence that I was able to build with my 2-1 was quickly then shattered again in my third draft, where I went 0-3. Luckily this time I was able to draft a Kithkin deck, so not another elf deck. However, we kind of started identifying that green decks with not many card draw or card flow was very, very susceptible to flooding or screwing. And this Kithkin deck was actually a very good example of that, where I am a Kithkin deck. I have like some strong Kithkin cards like the Watcher, Festival, Lieutenant, Eclipse, Aspirant, even the Command as well. But my overall curve is just very, very high. I don't have many 1-drops. I don't have many 2-drops. And I'm kind of clumped with many 3, 4, 5-drops. And this is just not the direction that this archetype wants to be in. And with so many 3 and 4 and 5 drops, I was very prone to flooding. So yeah, Swift 03, too heavy, not cohesive with what Kithkin wants to be doing. And yeah, so basically the third draft, the pack one, I started with a lot of like Kithkin bombs and just solid green and white cards. So I was thinking, oh, I can probably get into just a Kithkin deck quite, you know, smoothly. But it kind of started drying up as the draft was progressing and ended up here. And then after, you know, this previous 03, I was then able to draft again, kind of traumatized, where I just did really horribly with the Kithkin deck. I was only drafting green decks, and my teammates that was slowly identifying the elemental shells with, you know, many card draw, many removal, many advantage, really suggested me to learn how to build those decks as well and try and draft non-green decks. However, my fourth draft was yet again another Kithkin deck because I was able to open up an Abigail pick one, and then into like one of these Kithkin bomb. But with the previous draft and the draft review, I was able to learn my lesson, and I really focused on picking the cheaper creatures. And here we have a very solid deck. Unfortunately, the downfall of this deck was I lacked removal and kind of needed tricks to get through, and I lost to like a Doran deck, not being able to interact with Doran. But yeah, just overall very solid decks. And this is like a good example where, because the in-house pod are so much more like harder and stronger than the average PT draft pods, even these decks go like 1-2 and 0-3, and it's important not to be, you know, fixated on the result, but more important to focus on what learnings you've able to accumulate with that draft, and with the draft review, seeing what others around you drafted and how they drafted. So there we have me playing my draft deck, some others also drafting and playing their draft. But the really important thing is learning the pod draft dynamic. We're not drafting on arena because, you know, an arena draft is not emulating the pod dynamic, which is super important. And it's also really important to be 1 week ahead of the metagame, so we have an edge. And in combination of Eduardo's presentation, the in-house draft, where the more pods that we fire and the more reviews that we do after them, that basically propels us very quickly to learning what the format is about, and then progressing past that week 0, week 1 phase into that week 2, week 3 phase. And yeah, so yeah, using the pod draft dynamic to emulate the progression of the meta. And then after every draft, we have a mandatory draft review where everyone, all 16 players, are gathered around the draft table, and we just review. We basically have everyone listening, the drafters, how, what, and why they drafted the way they did, to try and reconstruct the whole draft and the story of the draft. This basically means that, like, with 16 members all there, it just becomes like a 16 people worth of testing in that very short one pod. So this is how we're able to communicate, how we're able to collectively learn and progress through the metagame. And yep, that's the limited portion. And next up, I'll be talking about the constructed portion. So after limited, the next part of testing for the Pro Tour is the constructed testing. And for this specific Pro Tour, the constructed format was standard. However, unlike other Pro Tours, it was very unique in that not only was the turnaround time from set release to the actual Pro Tour was very short, there was also a US regional a week before the Pro Tour on the actual release weekend, which meant that not only would we have this influx of information and data, we would also have to, you know, see what kind of like brews people come up with, whether it's similar to ours, whether a certain deck wins too much, so we have to pivot off or pivot onto, and etc. Which was interesting because by that time, when the USRC was happening, we would already be in the testing house, testing and refining our decks. So we basically had to be conscious of this potential influx in information and be able to last minute, you know, pivot and decide on what to use based on these data sets. However, I think this wasn't something that we did particularly well. In terms of the actual brews and the decks we registered, the first one was Azorius Control, championed by Lorenzo, Alex, and Arch. They all performed incredibly solidly, which probably makes this our most successful team brew, that I'll get into why I consider this as the most successful one. But the idea of this deck is basically, against the cup decks, you are structurally favored into them due to the removal suite you have. You have Seam Rip and Get Lost as really cheap interaction against their early plays. You have ways to catch up with their fast starts, such as the counter spells here and the Wrath. And then you also have this really important quick clock in Elspeth, as well as Elspeth being kind of a tap out cluster with Seam Rip and Wrath, meaning that once you clear the board with these and your opponent starts rebuilding, you can not only deal with that with Elspeth, but then quickly start turning the corner aggressively. The other thing that we found, which pushed this deck to another level, was this mana base. The idea is that we'd be playing 4 Demolition Field, 3 Founder Port, backed up by the 3 Sunken Citadels, because outside of the level 1 deck of the format, which was Lessons and the Simic Cup deck, we identified that some of the level 2 decks of the format, like Soul Tie Reanimator, Bat Airbending, even the 4-color Rhythm deck that took down the USRC, would only be playing 0 to 1 basics in their whole deck. So even if our game 1 configuration wasn't configured to fight these decks, we have this proactive angle of stealing the game, and then post board we can just back up our interaction with this angle of attack and basically not only cover the level 1 of the format, but also cover the different aspect of the format. So with this proactive approach, we essentially have this ability to play against and interact with the wide range of decks that is in the format. Ultimately, this was also a deck that was playing quite early on in the testing house, but pivoted off of thinking I wasn't good enough to play, or I wouldn't be able to learn the deck in time. So it was a bit of a cowardly decision by myself, and I really regretted it, and was one of the biggest level up moments where I kind of understood that if you obviously need both reps and the right deck choice, but when you're in the testing house surrounded by many amazing players, you can pick up a deck in very, very short time, just because of the amount of information that is always accumulated within the house. So if I was to go back and re-choose a deck, I would probably register this deck. The second deck of the team was the Bat Airbending deck, which was very interesting because this was also a deck that Worldly Council as a team brought to the World Championship and got pretty much beaten up by the Is It Lesson deck that the other teams brought. So we were already a bit skeptical of this deck going into the Pro Tour testing, because it's a 3-color deck with a 40 mana base. You're also a mana dork deck that walks right into Is It Lesson's cheap removal, and even if both your mana and your hand function smoothly, there's no guarantee in you assembling the combo, just because you could easily whiff off of Fetch Quest from Bumble Familiar or even the Ang. So essentially we just thought that this deck was quote unquote strong in what it was doing, but had a very high fail rate. However, with the addition of the interdimensional web watch, basically Fulcrum from the US Spotlight earlier that year, we basically thought that this would not only help us fight against all the removal and interaction, but also function in additional combo piece / redundancy, helping the issue of this deck a lot. Ultimately though, which is a common theme of our other decks in the team for this Pro Tour, but when we decided to sit down and actually stretch test the Cup matchup, we found out that the Cup matchup wasn't as good as we expected. Against a good Cup player that mulliganed really disciplinedly, the matchup was more closer to 50-50. And on top of that, in the previously mentioned USRC, the Bat Airbending deck just won a bit too much, posting really insane data results, basically indicating that this deck was quote-unquote favored into all the decks of the metagame. So people were very prepared to fight against this by the time the Pro Tour came around. So there were loads of Torpor Orbs in everyone's sideboard, which obviously isn't the place you want to be in if you're registering a combo deck like this. The next deck is the very infamous 33% win rate Soul Tie Reanimator deck that I unfortunately and regrettably registered. But the idea of this deck was, we thought with the new addition from the new set, this deck would be quote unquote pushed to another level, power level wise. We'd not only get Deceit and Wistfulness, which is a very strong fair card that lets you use Spider-Man in a very fair way, but also we would be getting the Formidable Speakers that would allow us to not only search up the Spider-Man, but also discard the combo piece to the graveyard. And all of these tied together by Glarb in the sideboard, letting us transition into a more fair, big mana mid-range deck, we thought was a very strong place to be in because of its proactivity and its ability to sidestep hate. We basically also just overrated the amount of Is It lessons there would be in the format, in the actual tournament. And this deck was really, built to prey upon like decks like Is It Lessons, where they didn't really have a strong configuration against graveyard combo decks, especially if they're backed up by Cavern of Souls to ignore all the counter spells. And we also overrated the cup matchup, where we were thinking, oh, we have all these hexes, we have the Bitter Triumphs, so we are able to stop their early plays and transition into a mid-range phase of the game with like Spider-Man, the Deceits, and then eventually combo with Bringer. However, against a good cup player with, Spider Sense or even just disciplined mulligans that really mulliganed to a fast start plus Riddler, we had a tough time keeping up just because we're super clunky. We need interaction to stop their early development, but then we also had to have an actual finisher outside of the 4/4 Spider-Man to close the game quickly before they would pretty much rhythm out and combo in the same turn. That's why we ended up registering cards like 0 Point Ballad, More Removal, and Glarb. So we would be able to just remove Wrath, Advantage, and try and win that way. But yeah, again, overrated the cup matchup. Especially, we also didn't test that much against the new variant, the 4-color variant of Cobb, where instead of playing Ouroboros, they were playing Gearhulk that could fetch Soul Guide Lantern, which was a problem because of two reasons. First, not only would they be able to search up their Soul Guide Lantern and use that as a, interaction against our combo deck, against our actual combo, the fact that they didn't rely on Ouroboros meant that we couldn't have the alternate win condition of removing their Ouroboros and copying with Spider-Man to present a quick clock. And then lastly, this was the deck Eduardo registered for the PT that put him into the top 4. And it was actually the deck that was help built thanks to the RC team. And basically what happened was, in the house, we were pretty, chaotic and just focused on our own decks. And Eduardo was not very convinced in all of the decks when he was looking at it from a data perspective. He also had to prepare the limited materials for us on the Wednesday, where we have the final limited meeting, just summing up the conclusions and telling us how and what we should look out for in our actual Pro Tour draft. But because of this, Eduardo basically outsourced his constructed testing to the RC team, where they absolutely delivered and crushed by identifying that this elemental shell was very strong, identifying Thunderflock as a card that was very strong into all the cup decks, and then this all tied together thanks to Winter Night Story. Not only was Winter Night Story very good in being a way to accumulate advantage, but it was just very good way of spending the early turns trying to bridge towards that mid game with Roaming Thrones and Thunderflock. Also, the ability to harmonize and dig and filter out cards that you needed for the matchup. For example, Wistfulness and Deceit for the Lessons matchup. For example, more Vibrance and Thunderflock for the Cup matchup was just really, really huge. So Otto basically took this Moneyball data perspective to his constructor testing and absolutely crushed it. So from this, the main learning that I was able to absorb and take in was, one, reps is important, but the more important thing is to be able to first contextualize the format and understand why you would be playing that deck, and choosing the right deck based on the context of the format. The second one is the contrary to that, and to not choose a deck based on quote-unquote raw power level, because often it's easy to misjudge a power level when you're comparing it in a vacuum, but also without the context of the format, you don't know whether a strong deck can thrive. And these aspects were something that I thought I was able to do properly, but I found out I wasn't able to do due to the pressure that the Pro Tour testing was under, with so little time and with the need to essentially learn two formats, a constructed format and a limited format. It's really hard to not get biased and not search for emotional comfort. And I believe that emotional comfort and this emotive element of testing is really, really hard to not only understand but to overcome. And here we have deck leader for the reanimated deck in Pivo, basically walking us through how to play a matchup. And then these were some of the brews that we actually tried out quite early on in our testing but ended up discarding. The first one was a blue-white Merfolk Convoke shell that utilized cards like Disruptor of Currents, the Harmonized Crescendo as payoffs, Deep Way Navigator as another payoff for having a lot of Merfolk in play, and then supported by enablers such as like Trapper, Pilgrimage, and removal with Seamrip. And yeah, this looked very promising. Again, it was doing something very strong when it was doing its thing. However, we had a few issues. The first one was very low card quality. For example, like if you didn't have Crescendo, if you didn't have like Frigate that essentially acted as a lord, you would be basically playing like these 2-mana 1/1s and 2/2s that just wasn't, meaningfully impacting the game. And then the second one is when you contextualized it in the actual level 1 metagame that we were expecting in Lessons and Cub. First, it was very hard to keep up with Cub because your removal is very narrow and limited to how many you can play. Like you essentially only have Seamrip as a way to interact against them early and in the main deck. And then against the Lessons deck, you'll be presenting these like 2-mana 1/1s, 2-mana 2/2s that easily get shocked down or just eye-rolled, and eventually they'll just remove your creatures and play their engine, and you basically don't have any fight against that. So we kind of quickly discarded this. The second brew we had was actually Mog's brew, where with the new printing of the Requiting Hex, the Fairy Fencing, and even the Bitter Bloom Bearer, and Spell Snare, these like interactive elements we thought really helped shore up the Cub matchup. And again, like the previous format, with all the Lessons deck moving away from Storm Chasers and Boomerang to a more controlling build, that just meant like Kaito was shining against those Lessons build, and being able to, one, be stronger into the Cub matchup due to the 1-mana interaction, and two, have this angle of attack against Lessons, we thought was a really good position to be in that dual deck format. However, just a few issues. The first one was awkward mana. Like you'd be needing black or a blue turn 1, and ideally turn 2 you'd be able to play this Bearer or one of the blue cards, and you'd need like black, blue, which was just like really awkward to do. The second one is outside of your fast Kaito draws, like your deck is pretty weak into Shock, so bad into Lessons, and kind of similarly, like outside of the Hex, the rest of the deck kind of lined up poorly into the Cub decks. So basically you'd have this 8+4 cards, so you'd have this 12 really strong cards that help you fight the format. But if you don't have those cards in the right matchup, it was just a bit weak and just not viable in our eyes. Well, although the next deck we tried was Kona Combo, and this was actually the deck that Zen was the most high on, and it's essentially the same idea as the Reanimator deck, where with the addition of like the Formidable Speakers searching up your 4-mana creature combo card that you can force through with Cavern of Soul, and you can fight through the removal pretty well, whether it's you just completely ignoring the removal with the Bringers or you blanking the removal with cards like Lost in the Maze. We thought that this deck would be very strong into the deck format, where against Lessons you can fight their interactions with these silver bullets, and against Cub you'd be able to present this fast combo where you would interact against them in one spot, like with Spell Snare or even with like Unable to Scream, and then bridge that to a fast combo finish. The thing we found out was, one, the mana base is very, very, very awkward because you'll be playing these station lands that is pretty essential to your combo. But then your deck overall is pretty mana hungry. Like you want to be playing spell snares so you can interact, or unable to scream to interact. But you also want to play these like cantrips so you can dig towards your combo piece. You also want to be able to play all your spells on curve because you have these. Essentially, you have the interaction plus cantrip. You have the 3 mana ways to dig towards your combo. Your combo is 4 mana. So you can only really play your station land in the first 2 turns. And that was just a really, really awkward way to play the early stages of the game. We also found out that the interaction, like these 6 interactions, they're good in the co-op, but overall, just not enough. So quote unquote bad interaction in the co-op. And then it's good versus Lessons, that's not wrong, but Lessons as a deck is very proactive. It's not really a control deck, it's a proactive combo deck. So if they have like a fast start, especially with Gran, there's just a high chance that your turn 4 combo that requires 3 pieces, so Kona, Omni, and Speaker, to just be a bit too slow, especially when you're on the draw. The thing that we were very high on was essentially the Speaker being not only a way to dig towards your combo, but in this deck, it's also your win con when you have Omni, because you can essentially go Speaker, find Meringue, play Meringue, bounce Speaker, play the Speaker to find the second Meringue, and go off from there as well. The next brew that we also brewed was this blue-black bounce deck, and the idea was, okay, we felt like the Fairies deck was just lacking on interaction. So what if we just play the bounce package to play just extra removal? Like Kaido is good into Lessons. The bounce package, if we bounce cards like Grim Bauble, Nowhere to Run, is good into Cobb. So why not just, play this over the existing blue-black deck, or play something similar to this as in the Esper Pixie deck. We ended up discarding both of these decks, so blue-black bounce and Esper bounce. But Team TCG player, where my good friend Nam is testing with, ended up registering Esper Pixie. So I guess it wasn't too wrong. The issues was, one, the clock was pretty slow. So even if we get a good start against Lessons, if they then assemble their engine, like even if we have Kaido, it's hard to keep up and race that. So just wasn't bad, but just wasn't, quick enough to close the game. So there we have it. 1 week in the testing house, all gone in an instant. And now on the Thursday, that's when we actually check out of the B&B and head towards the hotels near the venue for the actual Pro Tour. And on the bus ride up to Richmond, that's when the standard metagame breakdown came out. And it was very surreal to see the range of different emotions the team had. Like on one hand, you have Arch, Alex, and Lorenzo just cheering on this ideal metagame for them, where not only were the rhythm decks the most represented by a mile, where they have Simic, Bant, and 5-color combined roughly to about a 35% meta share. The bad matchups, quote unquote, in Dimir mid-range and Is It Lessons post-board was under 10%, like roughly about 8% altogether. And then the second and third most played deck after the Cup decks in Solitary Animator and Airbending deck was a matchup that they were extensively able to playtest due to teammates actually being on the deck. Outside of that, the fact they incorporated the Citadel plus Demolition Field package just allowed it so that these 3-color combo decks were not a bad matchup, where they could always cheese out wins, and even post-board, the matchup becomes even more solidly favored after all the good interaction coming in, backed up by this mana base. So, looking at the whole metagame, you have the rhythm decks where they're just structurally favored. You have the 3-color combo decks where their mana base attacking plan is good. And then, everything else, even the elemental deck here, since they rely so much on Cavern of Souls and tribal lands, like it was gonna line up great there as well. So an ideal metagame for the blue-white crew, whereas on the other hand, the Solitary Animated crew and the Band Airbending crew were kind of in awe to see the rhythm decks just have such a dominantly high meta share compared to other decks. Like for example, for Reanimator, a big reason to play this deck was its good matchup against Is It Lessons, like previously mentioned. So we expected Lessons to be at least, maybe not as much as Cobb, but at least in the second most played deck. But it's nowhere near in the top, like, top 5 decks. So with Is It Lessons not being represented, with airbending being pretty high, with a lot of mirror, and then having to play against probably the Cobb decks multiple times throughout the weekend, when you then lose the die roll or they not draw you, you're gonna have a pretty tough time. It was, let's say, a scary thought already by then. Similar story for the airbending crew as well. Like previously mentioned, in the last few days they figured out against a really strong Cobb opponent that understands the matchup, and Mulligan's really disciplined. The matchup was so much closer than 50-50. So whether if they had a dysfunctional hand or the Cobb decks just was on the play and had a very strong hand, that was also, a recipe for disaster. So off to a mixed start, I'd say. And then, mandatory tagging of Fire Shoes all coming back in person. It was lovely to see Robert. And then also another part of the Pro Tour is meeting your friends from other teams that whether you previously worked with or you traveled with, in the regional level. So I was able to meet with the Rampant Growth guys that I previously tested with for Vegas last year. Super nice to see. I was also able to meet the Italians that also did a Airbnb together, the testing house. So it was nice to also see them after a grueling week of snow and magic. And yeah, usually there's also a player party on the Thursday night before the Pro Tour where you get to socialize with everyone at the Pro Tour. So that was also pretty cool. My overall tournament was 7-9, spoilers. But just before talking about the tournament, a quick shot of our final team dinner that we did outside. We went to eat ramen, and also it was Eduardo's birthday, so we got some cookies on the way home. American cookies just kind of hit different compared to other cookies I've eaten. Spot on. But yeah, to just talk a bit about my day one, I would say being able to win against a few of the level 2 decks, like the Is It Blink deck Handshake brought, or the Is It Esper Pixie deck TCG player brought, was, let's say, draw to the Reanimator deck, where because we played this deck due to its power level in a vacuum, being able to properly capitalize and prey on these level 2 decks that really gunned against the Rhythm deck was a big plus. However, although I won against a Golgari here, losing against Simic here kinda solidified my worry, where I was, stabilizing, won game 1, stabilized game 3, didn't hit and stumbled on my 4th and 5th land drop and gave them just enough time to rebuild and kill me that way. Otherwise here as well against Demir, just color screw and mana screw. So I would say out of the constructed portion, getting out of day 1 with a 3-2 record, probably more than I could ask for, just because of the fail rate of the deck being really high and being clunky as well. Even though I went 3-2, the real highlight for me was here. In my previous Pro Tours, my draft record was never good. It was like 0-3 and stuff. So my confidence in Limited as a player was very low. It was low to the point where my friends would always joke about my Limited record being really bad. However, thanks to Eduardo, thanks to all the testing house reviews, and thanks to just the continuous support from the team, I was able to, get out of this killer roll of crushers with a 2-1 record. Like, if you look at my draft pod here, usually the day 1 draft pod are much, let's say, more lenient than the day 2 draft pod, because there will be some people that either couldn't test with a team or don't have much Pro Tour experience under their belt also inside. However, if you look at this, there's Theory Ramboa from Cosmos, Theo Jung from TCG, the scariest one probably here, Mark Paralino from Team Worldly Council, my fellow teammate, which also means that he also knows about Eduardo's drafting strategy. So it would be a fine balance of, would he also be, in that strategy? Would I have to pick the different lane, etc.? So always never a good sign to see fellow Worldly Council in your draft pod. But then also Maddie from Team Handshake and Ryan Bellamy from Sanctum. So a row of crushers. However, I come out with a very strong deck. So if you remember the previous slides from the testing house, I never drafted a non-green deck once. So then how was I able to draft this elementals archetype without actually drafting them myself? Was all thanks to not only Eduardo's slides and the data, but also the draft review, where just by being there, listening to my teammates talking about their draft picks and talking about how their draft went, also meant that that was directly my experience and my knowledge that I could apply for my draft as well. So learned a lot from the draft reviews, and I think both my draft decks really showed it. For example, you see solid elemental creatures like the Zealot, Stratosphere, Rooftop Preacher, and the Flamekin, as well as cheap creatures to fill out the curve and bridge to the mid and late game in Eclipse Flamekin, one of the best cards, Flame Braider, again a constructed playable card, and Explosive Prodigy, all coming together and forming a nice creature package. Outside of the creature package, I was able to play a really high density of strong removal like Cinder Strike here, Seer, Blossom Bind, Feed into the Flame, but also the 2 bombs in Ashling's Command and Soul Immolation, as well as this elemental copy spell. So, you know, an amazing elementals deck that actually surprisingly and shockingly wasn't the best elemental deck that, you know, everyone from World League Council built. Like, there were decks with the champion, there were decks with like more rare, there were decks with multiple commands. So it was like insane to see that our quote unquote one of the conclusions of the blue-red elementals deck being really potentially underdrafted by people and a good lane to go into just came out fantastically here, letting me pull out with a 2-1 record, losing to Theo and, you know, an unfortunate series of games with some mana and color issues. This is me just locking up day 2 after beating Nathan Stoyer, one of the, you know, role models for fellow Zoomers, as well as one of the best player in the game, especially when I was just starting to grind the competitive scene. So it was really nice to get to play against him, see his mastery in action, where he was able to not only deal with my Oko, deal with my board of creatures through a 1-outer of searing the Oko, specifically cantripping into ill-timed explosion to discard a big enough card to wrap the board away. So hitting that 1-outer, incredible plays, and just super nice to get to be friends with him as well. On the background, the other cool thing about the PT is even outside of the feature match table, basically every table, every row is a feature match. Like here you see the battle of the UK GOATs, where Matt Winsource is against Alex. Here you see Loopy, you know, in table 1, and then just behind that you see Christopher Lawson, the eventual winner of the PT, you know, fighting in the mid-second row of the tables. And then fast forward to day 2, I guess, you know, fortunately I was able to 5-3 and make it to day 2. And the day 2 pods are usually formed based on your result. So 5-3, middle of the pack, still day 2, so gonna be a strong pod, but I didn't expect a pod as strong as this. This draft included Javier, you know, ex-World League Council and good friend Liam, again, ex-teammate and good friend Adam Edelson, MSJ, the winner of the NRG Invitational this past year, Jason from Sanctum, that's been crushing, you know, the PTs the past year. And then there was me. Unfortunately, I didn't get to take a photo of my deck because it was a really hard build and really hard to navigate through the draft as well. So I didn't have time to take my draft deck, but it was a similar deck to my day 1 draft in that it was a blue-red elemental based deck. No, you know, really strong removals, unfortunately, like no command, no Cinder Strike, only like a Seer or 2. Had to play like the double bounce for some removal, but I was fortunate enough to have Zeal, Thunderflock, Disruptor of Currents, and Champion, the red champion. So unfortunately, against Adam with an insane Kithkin deck with multiple kin bindings, I swiftly lost. Against Liam, I made a crucial error in one of our games to lose. But then I was able to pull it off against Jason's soup deck. I guess a key, thing that was, highlighted from this draft was I actually drafted differently in day 2. Like day 1, I was pretty high and pretty optimistic of just heading into the elementals deck and see if elementals was open, and it luckily was. However, with such high level drafters all around the table for day 2, even more so than day 1, the packs were very dry. So I was actually drafting one of the Eduardo's secret strategy of green-red salvage archetype, where I would pick solid cards like Z and green creatures. However, while I was picking those cards, some elementals cards also flowed my way in pack 3, so I was able to quickly pivot back to elementals that I wanted to be. And again, all thanks to Eduardo. I owe him everything, all my success in draft and all my personal growth and confidence in draft as well. So there we have it. I guess before I end the actual recap, some unfortunate series of losses in constructed here after a great day 1 to end myself with only 2 wins in day 2. However, I wasn't very disappointed. It's still a solid result. It's still a big improvement since the last PT where I couldn't even make day 2, and it was also a humbling experience where we essentially overrated our constructed deck and underrated the most important constructed standard decks in the format. So yeah, choosing a deck based on power level, not based on the context of the metagame or the perceived direction, let's say, of the metagame, really costed me here. So no regrets. Great games overall. And yeah, there we have it. I hope you enjoyed a little recap of mine going over my testing process and my growth and experience I was able to have alongside my teammates from Team Rolly Council and my actual Pro Tour tournament. Next up will be my recap for the Arena Championships 11, and then after that there will be the Regional Championship recap where I'll be talking a bit about the process, the actual forming of the roster, and the brews that we also tried for that tournament alongside one of the new members, Maria. So I guess hope you guys enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, and see you in the next video.